Hello, friends. Hey there, friends. I'm LD Madera, and welcome to another special episode of Improv and Magic. This is our season finale episode, and we're ending season 5 with an absolutely amazing guest. Today, I get to talk to another one of the world's leading magicians. He's recognized all over the world for his exceptional skills in mentalism. My guest today is Banachek. His show has been hailed as the greatest mentalist act in the world by several of the top magic minds. Throughout his career, Banachek has performed to sold-out shows at trade shows, cruise ships, and theaters around the world. And he even headlined his own show at the Stratosphere in Las Vegas. His creations have become a very big part of mentalism and magic culture. In fact, most magicians you see today apply many of his own effects. Banachek has made hundreds of TV appearances, including CNN Live and The Today Show, and has also appeared in almost every major magazine and newspaper, from the New York Times to the National Enquirer. Banachek has consulted for hundreds of magicians and is sought out by some of today's major magicians, including Criss Angel, Penn Teller, and David Blaine. Simply put, Banachek has put more magic on television than any other magic consultant in the USA. In addition to being an incredible performer, Banachek is also known for his work in exposing people with so-called psychic abilities and other hoaxes. It all began after fooling scientists in an operation known as Project Alpha, which we discuss in this interview. He has also worked as president of the James Randi Educational Foundation, testing those with paranormal claims in the world-famous $1 Million Challenge, a prize that still remains unclaimed to this very day. I first saw Banachek perform years ago at my university, and at that moment I instantly became a fan. He's definitely the best mentalist I've ever seen, and talking to him was such a thrill for me. There's so much that's shared about his life and his work, it's an absolutely fascinating conversation you're sure to enjoy. And now, without further ado, here's my conversation with Banachek. Friends, I am so thrilled and excited to have joining me today on Improv and Magic. He is one of the top leading mentalists of our day and an all-around great guy. He is the one and only Banachek. Hi, Banachek. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, my friend. We've been trying to make this happen, and we finally got it.
We finally got it to work. You've actually been doing a lot of traveling lately.
I've been doing way too much traveling. I was just gone the last, 3 weeks. I'm home now for 2 days, but I'm doing everything else like this, trying to catch up in real life. I closed the show, and we can touch more on this later on if you want to, but I had a show at the Strat Casino Hotel, 650-seat theater, 837 shows, 3 years. I closed it in March. 2 days later, I was back out on the road doing theaters, doing fringe festivals, doing cruise ships, doing corporate, and it hasn't stopped since.
Do you kind of like that nonstop lifestyle?
Yes and no. You know, it's always greener on the other side of the fence. It's just like I always thought, maybe it'd be great to have a Vegas show where you get to stay home every single day and just go to work and then come back home. But that became like Groundhog Day in a way. You know, I'm very thankful for it and glad that I did it. But, 837 shows every day, getting up and having to be there at 2:00, not getting out to 8 in the evening. It kind of sort of takes most of your day away and then a large portion of your night as well. And you're doing it 6 days a week, but that seventh day, you're going out, you're talking to bookers, you're talking to the media, it's just, you don't get a day off. It's not a day off. Whereas if I'm doing cruise ships, at least even though I'm on the cruise ship, I'm having a couple of days of just chilling.
What do you normally do to relax on those rare occasions where you do have time off?
I don't. I really don't get to do too much. I have started to hike a little bit more, go up in the mountains and do a few things like that, but I really don't get to do much like that. It's just nice to have a day off and just not do anything.
Oh, I love that. I relish those days.
Yeah, no, those are good days. few and far between because there's always the phone and there's always the internet and there's always something coming through every day that I have to answer. But yeah, you know what? Years ago, I remember I went to South Africa. It was years and years and years ago. Cell phones were in the early stages. Well, I shouldn't say in the early stages because we had cell phones and we had internet, but internet was more in the early stages. And in those days, I always thought that I always had to be connected, always connected. And then when I went to South Africa, I couldn't get a SIM card. It's a long, long story. And I couldn't get online. And I went 3 weeks with no connection with the outside world, except for where I was performing at. That was it. And, I had my list of places to go. And then when I got done, I came back and I was like, oh, the world didn't end. You can, cut yourself off. You can disconnect. And I think we should do that more often.
You think it's hard for people to do that, to be able to disconnect?
I think it is. I think for various reasons. One, there's that emotional reason. Of course, you want to connect with people. But I think on a business end, you're always afraid you're going to lose that $1 million show that could have come through, because you weren't there, somebody else got it. And, sometimes life is more important. Enjoying life is a lot more important than a gig.
I hear you. Well, I'm excited to learn a whole lot more about you, Banachek. So let's start with, where did you grow up and what was growing up like for you?
All right. Well, that's not an easy, short little answer, is it? I guess I'll start at the beginning. I was born in England, 1960. My mom and I, we emigrated to the United States to be with my biological dad. That didn't work out that first year. My mom took me back to England with me in tow. She remarried. She had 2 kids. We emigrated to South Africa when I was 9. They were a year and 3 years old. My mom abandoned me in South Africa with an alcoholic stepfather who I barely ever saw, maybe on Sundays. That wasn't always a good thing. So I pretty much raised my brothers by myself till I was 15. I left there to go find my biological dad, who was in Australia. Moved to Colorado with him, moved to Pennsylvania. Some stuff happened. I moved out while I was in high school, had 3 jobs so I could finish high school and take care of some other things. And then I moved to Texas, lived there for 26 years, and now I'm in Las Vegas.
Well, talk about never stopping.
Yeah. I feel like my entire life I've always been taking care of somebody. When I was younger, I took care of my brothers. And there's been multiple occasions throughout my life where I'm always taking care of somebody. Even my ex-wife, when I married her, she had 3 kids immediately. And I've always been taking care of somebody.
Is that sort of a tough thing to go through when you're a kid, to having to deal with taking care of people while you don't feel like anyone's really taking care of you?
Not really, because you don't know any different, right? I mean, I got to do a lot of things most kids don't get to do because I didn't have those restrictions on me. The morals, the values that I had were very strict ones, but there were strict ones that were put on me by me and I put on my brothers, because I always felt like if I did wrong, I was going to influence them to do wrong. So ethically, I always tried to do the right thing. And even today, you're not always going to do the right thing, but my intent is to try to always do the right thing, to treat others the way that I'd want to be treated. And that's really important to me. But I do realize you can't please everybody. Even when you're trying to do the right thing, there's somebody who's going to take it as the wrong thing. So
it sounds like when you were a kid, you kind of had to mentally grow up pretty quickly.
Yeah, I did. But I also had to learn to fend for us, how to put food on the table, create games, think outside the box. And I think it's that thinking. I think it's that thinking outside of the box that's what enabled me to be creative, to create the things that I do today.
So what were some of the things that influenced you when you were a kid into being into a creative lifestyle?
Overall, it was just like I said right now, how do I put food on the table? How do I get food? Do I jump off a bridge onto a train and grab some apples and jump off the train? And I did do that. I did some things like that. But it was just always, it's how to live, how to function, how to make things work, how to rig things so they work. I couldn't, even when I started getting into magic, I couldn't afford big props. So I created my own props. I learned how to put things together from cardboard, from duct tape and old raggedy silks and things like that.
So when you were growing up, did you have any certain idea of what it was that you wanted to do with your life?
Yeah, I wanted to be a marine biologist. That didn't work
Really?
out. Yeah, I couldn't. But part of it was down the line. My path, took different directions. But also, I never got to go to college. I couldn't afford to go to college because I was always taking care of myself. When I was in high school, like I said, I had 3 jobs just to survive, just so I could have a place to live and go to school at the same time. I was also asked to play professional soccer one time, well, try out for a team. So I could have been a soccer player. Who knows?
Who knows? Well, let's get into magic. How did you get into that?
Yeah, I always thought all my life I've kind of thought about it, and for the longest time I thought I started when I was 16. I thought it was when at that point, and let's come back to that. Remind me, make a note to come back to that because the 16 part of my life was really the thing that led me into so many other directions. But I started wondering about it, and then I remember I'm not close to my mom because she abandoned me, but and I've tried to have a relationship with her, but she, unfortunately. A bit of a toxic human being, and I've had to cut her out of my life. But I did go to visit her in Ireland, and I always thought I was English, first of all. And I went there and I said, "Hey, Mom, what you doing living in Ireland?" She said, "You're Irish, you git." I'm like, "You never told me I was Irish all my life. I thought I was English." So yeah, English and American. But it turns out I'm Irish. Did the 21andMe, and I'm Irish. Definitely Irish. Anyway, so. On the table, there was a daffodil. And she said, "You know what we call those?" I go, "Yeah, daffodils." She go, "No, no, no. We call them Stephen's magic flower." And I went, "Why?" She said, "Because when you were a kid, when you were really, really young, you believed that they were magical because they'd close up at night and then they'd open up in the daytime. It was the most magical thing." And then she started telling me about my grandfather, who used to do these silly magic tricks for me. And when I say silly magic tricks, he'd like put a box on the table and it's covered and it'd say, "All right, now what I want you to do is I want you to close your eyes and I want you to think either coffee, tea, milk, or orange juice. And then say it out loud 5 times, and then say it another 5 times and another 5 times. And then now open your eyes, pull the cloth off, and inside of the box was whatever it was I was thinking of." So, and all it was my grandfather had all those drinks around the corner when my eyes were closed, because I was saying it out loud. He just put it inside the box. And I started going, "Oh, yeah, I guess there was magic in my life before I thought there was." And then in South Africa, when I moved to South Africa, I remember I was always trying to think of trick ways to do things. How do I get, if I'm playing soccer, how do I get the ball by somebody? How do I get the ball through their legs, by moving this way, moving that way? And then I also remember there was a magician that came to my school. And he did a thing where he was blindfolded. He had somebody write something on the blackboard. They erased it. And then he took the blindfold off, turned around, and he duplicated what they wrote. And in the classroom, everybody was trying to come up with ways that he could have done this. And I remember they were saying things like, "Oh, he could hear the chalk." And that. And I'm going, "I think he just see through the blindfold." And he just turned around and looked. And it turns out that's what it was, mystery of the blackboard, animate. So that's exactly what it was doing. And I also remember I went home. He did a thing where the silk goes into the egg and it becomes an egg. And, he tells you, "Oh, this is what you do." But then it turns into a real egg. And that's the sucker part of it. He breaks the egg in the end. So I went home and I made a hole in the top of an egg and I was pushing a silk into it and doing that. So I was fascinated by it. And it was while I was in South Africa that the rest happened for me, really. There was this superhero. Well, they said he was a superhero, who was coming to South Africa. And he claimed he could bend metal objects with his mind. And the whole world believed in it. Now, in South Africa at the time, they didn't have TV. They only had radio. And he said, if you bring a piece of metal to the radio, you're going to be able to do that in your home. So I'm sitting around with my 2 brothers, and my stepfather was, who knows, out drinking somewhere. And we're listening to him on the radio. And I went around the house during the commercial break to find a little needle that my mom had left behind in a sewing kit when she left. And I brought it to the radio. And he said, "Bend, bend, bend." And I held it up and I concentrated on that needle. And I believe that it actually had bent, that it bent on a micro level. And you have to think, why wouldn't I want this superpower, especially in the situation I was. And I also wanted to impress my brothers. I wanted them to think I had a superhuman power. But I really believed that needle had bent minutely on a micro level, but it had bent. And then it wasn't until I left there to go live with my biological dad, and we lived in Colorado just for a couple of months. I picked up a book by James the Amazing Randi. And it said that the truth about this superhero, that he was nothing more than a magician. And the superhero was Uri Geller. The book was The Truth About Uri Geller. And it said he was a magician posing as a psychic. And I'd never even thought about that because all the adults and everybody I knew around me believed in this, so I believed it had to be real. And I learned a valuable lesson reading that book. It was just because people in a position of authority, that doesn't make them authoritative. It doesn't give them the knowledge, it just means they think they know something. And so I got really upset, but it also started me on the whole critical thinking, skeptical movement. So from that book, there was a couple of methods for bending keys and a nail, and I started doing that. And then I started getting more bolder, and I started creating my own methods for bending spoons, forks. If you see anybody doing the twist today, I'm the one that created the twist. I'm the one that created the time bend. There's a whole bunch of stuff that I created, and I've even seen Uri Geller using some of my bends now. So yeah, it's come sort of full circle. But I did so much so that while I was in high school, all the kids were stealing silverware from the cafeteria. They went to plastic silverware until I graduated. I got in trouble for that. I figured a way to make the school bell go off early. Instead, I was doing it with my psychic powers. I was simply shorting 2 wires in the hallway, and the bell went off. I got in trouble for that in the end. And then from there, I wrote Randy a letter, and I said, if you ever need a kid to fool scientists into believing that psychic phenomena is genuine, I'd be happy to do so. Because Geller had been going around the world telling everybody that he was endorsed by Stanford Research Institute. And that's not exactly true. They had tested him, but they hadn't tested him under proper formal conditions. But he was going around the world telling people that. And parapsychologists had lamented for years there's no evidence of ESP under proper scientific protocol due to lack of funding. And at a very young, tender age of 15, I knew that wasn't the case. The problem was their biases were getting in the way. In other words, they were trying to document something that they already believed in rather than using proper science, first of all, to find out if it is genuine. And not just that, because they had PhDs, they believed they were too smart to be fooled. So I wrote Randy the letter, said, if you ever need a kid to fool scientists, be happy to do so. Never expected to hear from Randy. Did hear from him. He said, come visit me if you ever get a chance. I got the chance, went to Rumson, New Jersey, showed up at his house, and he had a house just like a wizard's house would be, right? The door opened on the hinge side, and there was a magnet for under a rock that you'd pick up and push the bolt across to get in the house. There was a clock that rang backwards. He had doves. He had macaws. He had a secret room that opened up. Just anything a magician would have, he had in there. And he never asked to see a single trick, not a single thing while I was there. So when I left, I was really disappointed. I thought, oh, well, that was a waste of time. Not realizing Randy was thinking ahead that if the opportunity ever came about, he wanted to be able to tell the parapsychologist, look, I didn't train this kid. He created all this himself. Can you imagine what would have happened had I trained him? I think back now and I realize if Randy had trained me, I would have looked more like a magician. But because my resources and my creativity came from looking at psychics and reading books about old psychics, I looked more like a psychic than a magician that was trying to look like a psychic. Anyway, I've done a lot of talking there. Yeah, I didn't get into Project Alpha. I'll let you bring that up at some point if you want to.
If there were ever a movie to be made, it should definitely be the movie about Uri Geller versus James Randi, because I remember reading all about that and the stuff that James said. And of course, I watched the famous appearance on The Tonight Show where Uri was basically embarrassed, yet he still was a big superstar. And, the fascinating thing about Uri Geller is that he was sort of the David Copperfield of the psychics at that time. In your opinion, what do you think it was that made Uri such a big deal? Because he really didn't have that many things in his repertoire.
No, Uri was, speaking of his repertoire, maybe we'll come back to that. I got a good story on that one. So I think it was the fact that he was charming. He was in the right place at the right time. You look back in the 1970s, 1980s, you had Russia, they had the Iron Curtain up and they were putting out all their propaganda. They were also putting out their stuff about their psychics. And the U.S. government had to listen. They had to take, note of it, because what if it was real, right? What if a psychic could really read a general's mind? You're kind of screwed. So you have to, if this stuff's coming out and it looks like they could do these things, you got to do research. Now they were spending about $21 million a year. The U.S. was on psychic research. Became what we know as Stargate. It was known by a bunch of different names. It changed names over time, but. And then you had In Search Of, which was on TV. It was one of the number one TV programs. Still had one of the highest ratings even today over so many shows. And that was all about psychic phenomena. You had Chariot of the Gods. It was really ripe for a guy like Uri Geller to come along and claim, the crown, so to speak. And you're right, Geller didn't have a lot in his repertoire. He only had a few things. I was doing a TV show. It was Criss Angel and Uri Geller. It was called Phenomenon. And Geller was one of the hosts, and so was Criss Angel. And I get a call out of the blue from, I thought this was so freaking ballsy, right? I get a call out of the blue from Geller. He says, "Hey, Banachek, I heard you're working on this show. And I know a lot about you, heard a lot about you. And, I only have a few things in my repertoire. I do this, the flower generation. I got the metal bending, and he went through the few lists of like 5 things that he does. And he says, but I've heard that if anybody could come up with a new power for me, it would be you." And I'm thinking, how ballsy is that? Knowing that I did Project Alpha, knowing I'm that close to Randi, because he can just deny the call. Even today, he can just say it never happened. It happened, but he could just say it never happened. And I have it's just my word against his. And that, even like right now when I'm telling the story, I'm well aware it's just my word against his. But I was like, man, that was ballsy. So anyway, we got in this conversation. And I said, "Gal, I can't do that. You know better than that. I belong to the skeptics and stuff like that, the groups. And, I've always been on the other side of this. And I think it's wrong, And I said, and if you claim on the show you have powers, I'm going to call you out on it. And Criss is going to call you out on it too." And he says, no, I don't do that anymore. I'm just there for the show and finding the next Uri Geller, And we talked for about 10 minutes. And 10 minutes into the conversation, he's like, "But I did find oil." I said, "Uri, stop." So he's a very, very charming man, a very charming man. It's when you're in his presence, he knows how to turn it on. He's a very, very charming man, a very talented man. I just think that he pushed science back a lot with his claims and the things that he was saying and doing. And a lot of people say to me, "Well, what does it hurt to people to have fun? Or what does it hurt to go to a medium?" Right? And the problem is, if you don't call that stuff out, it erodes critical thinking. Critical thinking is something that you have to practice every single day. And it's something you should be thinking, critical thinking. It doesn't mean to be negative or anything like that. It just means before you put that pill in your mouth, you better know what you're taking, right? And I think it's part of the problem we had with COVID because people forgot how to think critically anymore. Nobody knew what to think. And you weren't allowed to think. You're not allowed to question anything, right? And we should be allowed to question every single thing. But people just don't. They just follow things blindly and then they only listen to things that go along with their own biases. And, it's a shame where the world has gotten to today. And that kind of stuff that doesn't help.
Well, this obviously transitioned us into what you alluded to earlier, which was a Project Alpha. And it is such a fascinating story. And it was you. And of course, James Randi was sort of the puppet master of all this. And I forget the other gentleman that was involved.
Mike Edwards.
Mike Edwards, yeah. Yes. Could you talk about how the idea of Project Alpha came about and what was your experience going through that entire process?
Yeah, I hate to push people to another podcast. We're going to go over it some, but there's just not enough time here. Brian Brushwood, if you know Brian Brushwood, he does a podcast called The World's Greatest Cons. So when we're done talking about this, anybody that wants more information and wants the behind scenes stuff on this, because can go there. It's actually 7 episodes. It's season 3, starts with 301 and it goes on from there. And like I said, it's 7 episodes. Well, it's mainly 4 episodes, but there's follow-up stuff that came up as a result of that. And there's no way we're going to cover all of that here. But Project Alpha came about because back in the 1980s, as I said, scientists lamented there's no evidence ESP on a proper scientific protocol. At a young age, as I said, it was my belief. It had nothing to do with that. It had to do with their biases. So I wanted to go in and I wanted to fool the scientists. Plus, there had been some parapsychologists that said, if you could introduce a magician to the parapsychology world, go ahead. Good luck. Didn't think they were going to be fooled. So I thought it was time to go in because they weren't listening. These parapsychologists, they're the ones with the loudest voices telling everybody this stuff's real. And they just wouldn't listen. So we felt we needed to go in. The opportunity came about in 1979. McDonnell Douglas Aircraft gave a $500,000, which doesn't sound like a lot in these days, but back then it was a lot of money. It gave a $500,000 to Washington University in St. Louis. A gentleman by the name of Peter Phillips was put in charge. Now, I remember I was at Washington Hospital. I was scrubbing floors, and there was a girl that I knew who brought me an Associated Press article because Peter Phillips had taken out put out an Associated Press what do you call it when you put out a release, and saying he was looking for kids that could bend metal with their minds. And I was like, oh, that's right down my alley. You know, I can bend metal with my mind. So I wrote him a letter, and I was accepted. Now, I didn't tell Randy right away. I ended up getting a phone call from Randy like 2 weeks later. I was about to call him, actually. And he called me up. He said, Banachek, well, my name was Steve Shaw back then. He said, Banachek, there's this guy in St. Louis. He's been given $500,000 to study psychic phenomena. I said, think of his initials. Does it start with a P and the second initials a P? He says, yeah, how do you know? I said, I've already been accepted. I was going to write you and let you know. He told me about another kid by the name of Mike Edwards. Now, Mike had already been there, and Mike had been some keys for them, and they were flabbergasted. You know, it was like Mike could do no wrong. But Mike didn't quite know where to go with that, and so he went to the number one skeptic in the world. He went to Randy, and he called Randy up, and he told him what had happened, and asked for some pointers. It was Mike actually who came up with the idea that it would be called Project Alpha, not Randy. It was Mike that did that. And Mike asked about me, and because Randy had told him about me, so Mike was asking questions about me. And one of the things says, "Well, is he any good?" Because if he's not any good, and he shows up, and he's going to blow my cover, I'm going to go ahead and blow his cover before that happens. If he's not any good. And I asked Randy sort of the same question. I said, "What do you know about Mike? Is he any good?" And Randy said he didn't know a whole lot about Mike, and so I kind of felt the same thing, but. When we got to the airport, when we landed in St. Louis, we both landed in about an hour of each other. And we met each other, Mike and I did, before we met Peter Phillips. Peter Phillips was coming to the airport. He was getting a rental car at the time. And Mike and I hit it off. We just knew right away, like we were messing with each other, joking with each other. And it was just like, okay, this is a cool guy. And he was like, oh, that's a cool cat as well. And we just started up and running immediately. For some reason, I didn't have my driver's license with me. Now, keep in mind, this is back in the day when you didn't even need an ID to fly. You just needed a plane ticket and get on a plane. But I can't remember why I didn't have my license, or if I had an ID but I didn't have a license. Anyway, I wasn't able to drive a car, so I couldn't drive the rental car. Mike was too young to drive the rental car as well. So Phillips took the rental car, and he let Mike drive his car. And so we're following Phillips, like we're behind him, we're following him. And Mike's driving. I look in the back seat, and I see that there's a briefcase in the back. I went, oh, interesting. So I pull it over to the front under the dash. I try to open it. It's locked. And I'm like, oh, they don't want us to get in there. So then I pick the lock. I open it up, and there's all this cutlery, there's silverware in there, forks, spoons, knives. I'm like, this must be some of the stuff they're going to use for the experiments, unless Peter Phillips is a kleptomaniac, and steals silverware. So I bend up a bunch of it, close it up, put it in the back. I sit there twiddling my thumbs for a few more seconds. Open the glove compartment. There's some keys in there. I bend them up, and anything else that's metal, I close it up. Mike's looking at me like, what the hell? I start to reach over for keys in the ignition that were hanging there, house keys. And he slaps my hand. He says, I think you've done enough damage. And that's where we started, like up and running. Now, the reason I did that is because there's a thing called spontaneous PK. And supposedly psychics sometimes get this energy and they get too much of it, and it just puts itself out there and it's uncontrollable. And these spontaneous PK things are those type of things. And it also, when the scientists see this, they think in their head, man, this is good. I'm going to get this. Someday I'm going to get this on video. I'm going to get this on video. We also didn't know in the beginning if they were going to be using, trickery to try to catch us. Like, are they going to leave cameras running when they say they're off during the breaks? Is there a one-way mirror somewhere that we're not, we're not privy to? So all of our bends in the beginning were with the metal was, that's what we started out with metal bending. All of our bends in the beginning were on a micro level. Now, Randy had sent them 11 caveats. And the 11 caveats were things that you shouldn't let the psychics do if you're doing experiments. Don't let more than one psychic work at a time because they can distract, for each other. Don't let them work with more than one object at a time. And the list went on and on and on. When we first arrived, Mike and I, that time together, they showed us the list of caveats that Randi, this magician, we acted like we didn't know who Randi was. This magician Randi had sent us. Look at these. How ridiculous are these? These would make you really uncomfortable. And they threw them in the trash. Whereas if they had followed those 11 caveats, we wouldn't have got away with anything at all. So in the beginning, as I said, the bendings were on a micro level. And Randi had said, mark everything on a macro and a micro level. That way the psychics would see the macro, but they wouldn't see the micro. And if they were cheating, you'd know they switched out the silverware, right? The way they did it was they put number tags on it, like string tags on each one. They measured them at the bowl and at the end of each end of the piece of cutlery, and they made a notation. Number 13, these are its measurements. Number 12, these are its measurements, and so on. I realized that if I picked up, one thing was don't let the subjects control the experiment. I break that rule right away. I pick up a fork and I go, this tag's getting in my way. Do you mind if I remove it? Oh, no problem. I'm controlling the experiment now, right? I rub it. Nothing happens. I put it down on the table. Now, let's say that was number 13. I pick up number 12, right? I probably would have picked up number 1 if the numbers aren't that close in the list. I pick it up. I take that tag off and I put it down, pretend to concentrate. But then when I pick it up, I put 13 on, 1 and 1 on 13. And then I wait maybe an hour or so. And then I pick one up nice and cleanly. I might pick up number 1, concentrate on it, barely touch it. And I say, I think it moved, I think it bent minutely, and they'd measure it. And sure enough, it's been 1 millimeter or 2 millimeters. And then the other thing, sometimes if there were 2 pieces of cutlery on the table, and I'm holding one, I can just lean over and press on one piece of cutlery because I'm using more than one piece of cutlery at a time, which is one of the things Randi said not to do. Later on, when we realized that they weren't trying to catch us, that they really believed in this, we started to get a lot bolder. The students, the first time we were at the campus, and the students on campus, they were skeptical. The professors weren't, but the students were. And so they hid a bunch of cutlery and stuff in the other room, in the video tech room. And I was standing there one time, and I just happened to look, and I saw underneath one of the video recorders, I saw a bunch of cutlery hidden, and some cars. I went, what's that all about? I didn't say it. I kept it in my head. So when there was no one around, I bent those up and put them back underneath. And that convinced the students, because they found it themselves, that something, unusual was going on here. We ended up doing a whole bunch of different experiments. They tested us for all kinds of psychic phenomena, making rotors move under a bell jar. That was one of the fun experiments. So there's this spike that comes up and a wooden round circle disc on the bottom with a groove in it. And then on top of it is a glass bell jar, and that goes out. And on top of the spike, inside the bell jar, there is a little rotor, and it's always been sprayed down, so there's no static, anti-static materials. And they said, and I always just said yes to everything. Mike was more conservative. He was training to be an attorney. Me, I didn't care. I just did anything and everything, and took probably too many chances. Could have got caught a couple of times. But anyway, they said, can you make the rotor move to the left? I'm like, oh yeah, no problem. I concentrate. Next thing, it's moving and it's rotating to the left. Can you now make it rotate to the right? I'm concentrating and it's moving to the right. And Mike and I had a cue that if we ever wanted to speak to each other, we'd tap each other under the table with our feet and say, hey, do you want to go get a drink? Because the drinks were all the way down the hallway outside of the Mac Lab, all the way down the hallway. And because they ended up having a place called the Mac Lab where they ended up doing experiments that were no longer on campus. It's a whole dedicated place. And when we were down there, we would discuss the experiment that just happened. Mike says to me, I remember on that time with the rotor, he said, Steve, he said, how the fuck are you doing that? I'm going, and I said, Mike, you're not going to believe me if I tell you. He says, no, you got to tell me. I'm like, well, we've been sitting here and we come here like on weekends and, we spent over 180 hours there, over 3.5 years, I think it was. And, I said, I just realized after all this concentrating that I'm really psychic. And he pushed me up against the wall. I said, no, tell me, I'm like, all right, I told him. So he went back in the room. Next thing, he was making a move to the left and to the right. And I held on to this one for a long, long time because it was the one that people always saw because there's videos of the stuff we were doing. And I held on this one for a long time. But what I realized is if I me, and I'm not supposed to be touching this stuff according to Randy, but if I put the bell jar on, I could put it in so it didn't quite settle in. That left a little gap on the bottom. And if I blew from one direction, the rotor moved one way. If I blew the other direction, it went the other way. Then at one point, for whatever reason, they decided to put foil over the bottom of the bell jar. And that made my life a little easier because all we did was we took a little piece of tinfoil, dropped it into the groove. So now there's a permanent area where it's not going to settle properly. They can take it and put it on top themselves. Another one that I did was we would move objects. And I had a great link up that I had created with an invisible thread before invisible threads became really popular with magicians nowadays. Everybody has loops and stuff. We didn't have loops then. And so it was a hookup that went to my one hand and the other hand came into it. And it's harder to actually describe. It's just easier to show. But anyway, I'm moving the clock forward and the thread breaks. So it's no longer hooked to my body. It's just so now I hook a piece of thread between my two index fingers and I'm moving the clock forward and then I lift up and I go over the clock and I come back and it comes back to me. And it's obvious, it's pretty damn obvious what I'm doing. But they used that on their video for the parapsychologist saying this was genuine ESP. And National Enquirer, they asked me, they said, it looks like maybe you have something between your hands and you're pushing it and pulling it back. I go, yeah. What I do is I imagine that there's a beam between my fingers. And so I'm pushing it forward. So I have to really believe it. So now I got to pick it up and bring it over and bring that beam back in order for it to come back. They took it hook, line, and sinker and believed it. So, but anyway, after all those years, we came out and said it was all a hoax. It changed parapsychology forever. Mike, myself, Randy ended up being in every parapsychology textbook. We ended up being in every psychology textbook in every university around the world. And a lot of people, well, not a lot, but a few parapsychologists spoke up and said, hey, it's not fair to fool people in the name of science. And it's like, well, it's not fair to take money and not perform proper science as well. Now, going back to the caveats, if they had to listen to Randy, and Randy would offer to come in all the time, and every time we did a project, we would call Randy and we would tell him exactly what we just did. He would shoot them a letter right away saying, hey, if you're ever doing something with a bell jar, you might want to blah, 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 blah. And that's probably why they put the foil on the bottom. It was probably something that Randy had said to them because he didn't always tell us everything he said. But we know that he was in communication, writing them letters and telling them exactly what we did. But there was a TV producer for BBC. I think it was BBC. It was an English channel. And he was a major producer, and he came over, and it was a convention that Geller was at as well. It was right before we were going to be coming out and saying it was all a hoax. And he wrote Randy a letter, said, what would convince you this is real? And Randy said, well, if you follow these 11 caveats, I might think it's genuine. So he sent him the 11 caveats. And it was me, it was Mike Edwards, another kid by the name of Masawaki Kyoto. And Masawaki Kyoto was known for twisting forks. But he had a gimmick in his shoe that when nobody was looking, he would go under the table, put it in his shoe, give it the fork a twist or a spoon a twist, and then bring it out and make it look like he was twisting it. It became the holy grail for me to figure out how can you do that without a shoe and without a gimmick, right? And I found it finally by accident. But anyway, so nothing happened that whole day, except for one thing. He did give us these electronic watches. Now, these are the ones that you now buy for like $1 and you give them to the kids. Back then, they were brand new and they were real expensive. So he gave me one, he gave Mike one, he gave Masawaki Kyoto, this Japanese kid one, which, by the way, Masawaki Kyoto, I roomed with him at that convention, spoke perfect English until I happened to say to him, Masawaki, like when you don't have your powers working, do you ever use a trick? Trick? I don't understand it. I do not speak English. All of a sudden, he couldn't speak English. But anyway, back to the experiments. All day we're there and nothing happens. Except for the watches, because Mike had the brilliant idea at lunch to put it in his sandwich and put it in the microwave. And when it came out, it was all gibberish. And they thought that was a miracle. But anyway, so now the cameras go off, everything gets shut down. Nothing's happened because he's followed Randy's caveats. And I see Masawaki go under the table and he comes out and he's twisting a fork. And this producer sees him twisting a fork, but there's no camera on it. He's not getting it on camera, and he has a complete mental breakdown. Now, you might think mental bending is just a trick. It's not that big of a deal. This guy had a complete mental breakdown, started screaming and yelling that Randy was the devil. Randy is evil. He should have never listened to Randy. If he didn't listen to Randy, it would have been comfortable. We would have got this on tape. He looks down at his pants. He's got a big wet splotch there. And he looks down. He says, "Oh my God, I've had a demonic ejaculation." That's the words he used. Demonic ejaculation. So the guy was having a nervous breakdown, like complete nervous breakdown. I had to spend the night in his assistant's room all night long with her because he was calling her all night long, screaming and yelling about Randy. And it kind of scared Mike and I. And so we said, "Randy, we kind of want to come clean." Randy's like, "Just hold off 2 more months." And then the TV show's coming out. So we held off. But yeah, well, that was a really, really scary moment. And the hard part for me and Mike was we went in this thing thinking we were the knights, white knights, right? We're coming in and we're going to shine a light on truth, right? Rather than all the lies that, other people were putting out saying they were psychics and that. Not realizing that the professors were out of their league, but they were really good people, kind-hearted, really nice people, and they became our friends. So now we're lying to our friends, right? We're going to hurt people we care about, maybe for the greater cause. And would I do it again? Yes, but I would not have got as close. And I just, we're going to be ruining people's reputations. And we got in way deeper than we expected. And that's why I say, go listen to the other podcast because it really deals with that in great, great detail, the dilemmas that Mike and I had. But that's Project Alpha. And that was just one of many things that I did with Randy.
If there's one phrase I'm definitely going to take away from this interview, it's demonic ejaculation.
Hey, I don't think I've ever had one.
So going through all of that in your experience through Project Alpha and in your interactions with James Randi, were those sort of things that furthered your interest in becoming a mentalist?
No, I was already becoming a mentalist because I was already creating ways to bend metal and do these things. When I started out as a mentalist, I didn't realize that there was a category of magic called mentalism. I had no idea there was that. I was just creating my own stuff. When I created PK Touches, that was based upon something I read about a psychic in a John Mulholland book. Basically the psychic said that there was a pretty girl, he was Italian, and said there was a pretty girl across the street. And he imagined he was pinching her butt. And when he imagined it, she turned around, held her butt, but there was nobody there. And that's how he found out he could touch people from a distance. So that's where PK Touches came from that. All I knew was that there were people posing as psychics that were using tricks. That's the only thing I knew, and that was because of the Randi book. So like I said, I when I created all my Russian roulettes, I was the first one to do a Russian roulette with knife. That was not based upon anything magical that was out there. That's why I came up with so many original things, because I wasn't hanging out with other magicians. In fact, I'd already been doing shows at some of the malls in like Washington, Pennsylvania and places like that while I was working with the scientists and saying, but I was told to say I was a real psychic. Randy said, keep that facade up. So I did, which I felt really weird about because I'm lying and it's exactly what I was against. But I had to do it in the name of this thing to get into the parapsychology labs, right? But at one point, there was a guy by the name of Mac, I'm going to say his name wrong, Mac Picnic, I think his name was. Boy, I'm getting old. Jeez, Mac Picnic. Mac Picnic had I'm going to go Mac Picnic, even though that doesn't sound right. But he had a psychic rabbit, and he did close-up. And the rabbit was there, and the rabbit would help with the tricks. And the last thing is the rabbit would roll out an American flag, and that was the big finale. Well, this guy came to see me at one of my shows at Washington Mall, and it was all original stuff. And he was like, "Man, nobody's ever seen anything like this. You're amazing. You've got to come do the show in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. It's now in Pigeon Forge, So, and I was like, okay. Now, in my mind, because I didn't know anything about magicians, didn't hang out with any magicians, didn't know any magicians, at this convention, all the best magicians in the world were going to be there, right? It's a magic convention. And all the best magic's going to be there. And I'm now embarrassed about my stuff, not realizing that it was actually really good original stuff. So I buy one of the Tennant's catalogs, that you had to buy back in the day, big thick thing. And I go through it and I figure, hey, if it's in if it's a magic store, it's got to be good. Otherwise, they wouldn't be selling it wrong. But I'm going through it and I pick out this thing. It shows up. I start working on it. I go to the convention and I do it and I bomb. It was like the crappiest, like I was so embarrassed. I did go down to the room where the magicians hung out later, and I hung out with them, and I redeemed myself with the metal bending and the stuff that I do, right? But I stayed away from magicians for another 5 years after that. Little aside on this, when I first got to the convention, there's this guy there, and he's all crazy looking and everything else, and he says, and he's putting his hand in a bear trap, and then everybody leaves. I'm standing there and he says, "You want to learn how to put your hand in a bear trap?" I said, "Well, okay." He has me putting my hand in the bear trap, and then after I've done it, he's like, "Ladies and gentlemen, come see the wonder kid who can put his hand in a bear trap and not get harmed, blah, 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 blah." And he's going on and on. He tells me also he does magic where he cuts snakes in half and stuff and things, all this crazy stuff. So anyway, I do this and everybody's around, right? And then I leave the convention. Now, that's in Tennessee. I'm living up by Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's a small freaking world, I tell you. I'm working in the 3A ward. The 3A ward is the crazy ward. You might be able to see where I'm going with this. I'm actually buffing the floors in there, and I hear, "Hey, Steve, what are you doing here?" I turn around. The guy that was having me put my hand in the bear traps and doing that stuff was locked up at the crazy farm. So yeah, small world.
Small world.
Yep.
Because you are so great at what you do, I imagine that from time to time, you've probably encountered some audience members who probably believed, or at least want to believe, that you could be psychic. Have you encountered audience members like that? And if so, how do you deal with them?
Every show I encounter those people. So let's take this back just a little bit, because this goes really to disclaimers, I think. When I started out, mentalism wasn't part of the real lexicon of magic, right? There weren't really. You had Kreskin, you had a couple other people, maybe in the college market. You had Gill Eagles, but it wasn't a known thing, right? There were very few mentalists that were around, and it was rare. And the majority of mentalists that were around wanted people to believe they were genuine psychics. That was, and I think part of it is because when you start out doing magic, you almost need people to believe to get away if you're not very good in the beginning. And then you get good by repeat performances and stuff. You get good, but you hold on to that crutch of people believing. It's kind of like going to see a hypnotist. It's a lot easier if people come to the hypnotist and they've already been hypnotized before. They believe in hypnotism, right? Your job's partway done. So people believe in psychic phenomena. Your job's partway done. It's like the first time I saw Geller perform. I couldn't believe that he was getting away with what he was getting. He was doing the mystery of the blackboard we talked earlier, but he was holding up a big piece of cardboard next to his head so he couldn't see behind him, putting his head down. And slowly, while the person's drawing on the board, he's turning his head. And I'm like, he's just fucking turning and looking. He's not even using a blindfold. And don't they see this? And nobody would see it because all the people that were there believed in him. So, and then I always felt dirty about that, right? Saying that I was a psychic. It's what I was against because it was a lie, and a big lie at that. And maybe I'm converting people over to believing in psychic phenomena by doing these things, and I'm using trickery. So I felt weird about it. And then I heard Randy. I was talking to Randy about this whole problem that I have with it, but it's all I know how to do. I only know how to perform. I don't know how to do anything else at this point. And Randy told me about Ned Rutledge, and Ned Rutledge was a guy who was a teacher as well. And he had given a lecture, a one-off lecture, taking his 5 known senses to create the illusion of a 6th sense. And I went, "Oh, that's good. That's good." I got a hold of Ned, and he said, "Yeah, I only used it for one lecture." He says, "Feel free to take it." And so I took it, and I ran with it, and I kind of made it a major piece of mentalism, an explanation, another way to present yourself, taking your 5 known senses to create the illusion of a 6. You use verbal communication, nonverbal communication, lots of magic, psychology and perceptual manipulation. Got to have the magic in there, right? And some people say, well, psychology. Yeah, there's bits of psychology through every damn thing that I do. And I have effects that rely purely on psychology. And if they don't work, nobody knows they haven't worked. But yeah, there are. Why do I place this here instead of over here? Because I know more likely it's going to get selected if I move it over here rather than over there. So I'm using a lot of psychology. So none of that stuff was a lie unless you take out the word magic. Now it's a lie, right? So for a while there were a bunch of mentalists that said, well, one in particular, Leo, there's no place for a fake mentalist. And I'm like, first of all, we're using the word mentalist. We're not calling out psychics. So we are fake. Why else would we need that word, right? And then I took College Entertainer of the Year 2 years in a row, Novelty Entertainer of the Year. And I was like, oh, Banachek's the exception. I'm like, No, that doesn't even make any sense either, right? If I can do it, other people can do it as well. And then Darren Brown, with Andy Nyman's help, ended up doing their first TV show. And the problem there, they created another lie in a way, saying everything was done by neuro-linguistic programming, NLP. And that's okay for a presentational standpoint, but you still got to come back and remind them it's a trick, right? And Darren wasn't doing that in the beginning. And so he ended up had some problems with it. Started getting some people, a reporter exposing his tricks, saying this is not NLP, this is a trick, and that's how it's done. So he ended up doing a 180 on that and embracing almost completely the other side of things with the disclaimer. And so, because if you say it's NLP, you're getting to a point where you're going to convince people that if they go do these studies, they can do this too. And it's never going to happen. They're never going to be able to duplicate what we're doing with NLP classes or anything like that. So I feel a responsibility. So there are all these people who are going to come believe no matter what, getting back to your question on the left, right? And then on the right, there's all these people that are not going to believe no matter what. They're the skeptics, right? I'm not going to change their mind. No matter what I do, I'm not going to change their mind. And I'm not on stage to change belief systems. That's exactly what I'm not there for. I'm there to entertain, but there's a very large portion, much bigger than even if you put those other two together, in the middle, that come to these shows who've never seen a mentalist before in their life. And I become the authoritative figure of what this is. What are they seeing? If I say it's psychic, they're going to believe it's psychic. If I say it's NLP, they're going to believe it's NLP. Darren Brown's a perfect example of that. Convinced so many people of that. Yeah, Gallo's another one, right? Convinced so many people it was psychic. So I have a huge responsibility of those people in the middle to remind them that it's not real. Now, the comeback on that, which just makes no sense to me, like if you just took a second to think about it, some mentalists will say, well, if I was doing Macbeth, I'm not going to stop in the middle of the play and say, excuse me, I'm just an actor playing the part of Macbeth. I just wanted to let you know. Well, of course not, because it's freaking context, right? You come to see Macbeth, you know it's a play. You come to see me performing, you don't know I'm a magician. You don't know if I'm a psychic. All you know is that I'm the authoritative figure on what I'm talking about. Same as if you did Macbeth in that show the night before. Tonight, you have an actual real person giving a TED talk on the human mind, and it's a neuroscientist. You're going to go real quick. That's a real neuroscientist. That's not an actor, right? So I have a responsibility to those people in the middle to remind them this is not real. And I tend to do it at the beginning. I tend to do it in the middle, and I do it at the end of my show. Sometimes I'll do it in other places as well. So yeah, for me, I can't do a lot about those people that believe, and I don't want to get in an argument with them because they're coming to my show to have a good time. They're paying a ticket to have a good time. So you want to believe in psychic phenomena, that's okay. Maybe that's a discussion we have another day if you're up to it and you want to have it. And people will tell me their stories about a ghost they saw and this and that, blah, blah, blah. And I just nod my head. I go, yeah. And they go, do you believe in psychic phenomena? I say, well, I haven't seen anything. I run $1 million foundation where we test psychics for their abilities, and the moment we put them under proper scientific scrutiny, they fail. But that doesn't mean it's not real. I don't want to invalidate their thinking or what they believe. And that's not my job at all, right? Especially in the context of a show. I'm there to make people have a really good time. Did I answer your question?
I think you did. What do you think about the psychic business today? Because I remember a time where there was a psychic on almost every other TV show,
yep.
Right? Daytime talk shows, late night talk shows, some had their own shows. Now, as far as mainstream media, you don't really see them featured anymore.
Because they have so many other outlets, social media, but they find their people that way. They don't have to blast themselves on the TV at everybody. Although there's still a couple of ads lately, we only take the best psychics. We don't take every single psychic. We take the best psychics, CaliforniaPsychics.com or whatever the heck it is, and so it is up there. But now it's done very much. You can take your Facebook ads and you can point them in the direction of people that believe in all the spiritual woo-woo stuff, and you're not going to be wasting your dollar. It's much better spent. So you are probably not going to see that stuff. I may or may not, because of the world I live in, see some of that stuff. But there's other people that don't, the non-believers aren't going to be seeing that stuff. They're not after the non-believers. They're after the believers, right? And going back to the mediums, because I do want to touch on this for a minute. A lot of people say to me, well, it makes people feel good to be able to think they can talk to their loved one. What harm is that? It's a lot of freaking harm. I mean, I can give crack to a junkie it's going to make him feel good doesn't mean it's good for him. What these grief vampires are doing is basically halting the grieving process. And there's a reason we have the grieving process. It's a reason it's part of our nature. And we go through it. Everybody goes through it when they lose a loved one, except for those that think they're still talking to their loved one. They stop talking to the living. I had a very good friend who had a son who died of cancer at 10 years old. And she had 2 daughters and she had a husband. And of course, poor woman, right? Big hole in her heart. And she's trying to fill it. And a freaking medium convinced her she could talk to her dead son. She stopped talking to her daughters and her husband. She was so consumed with talking to her dead son. She almost ended up in a divorce, which means she would have lost her husband and lost her daughters. Luckily, she came to her senses at one point. But that's the kind of crap that these people do. They halt the grieving process, and it is there for a reason. And I don't care what you say. They're doing it for money. And even if they're not doing it for money, they're doing it for secondary gain. They're getting attention, and they're loving getting that attention, right? It's just like when a mother drowns her kids or makes her kids sick, right? Because she's getting attention at the hospital. It's the same kind of sickness.
Eventually, you, of course, did have the opportunity to get to know and work with other great magicians. Of course, we talked about James Randi. Yep. You've worked with other fantastic magicians like Jamie Ian Swiss. And, of course, I remember the many times you appeared on Criss Angel Mind Freak. What is it like for you to be able to collaborate with a lot of these great magicians?
Well, with Mind Freak, it was a little bit different. I had been touring with the colleges. As I said, I took Entertainer of the Year. I took every award I could possibly take, and I was making as much money as I possibly could in the college market. And I'm one of those people, I change. Before that, I was doing trade shows. Before that, I was doing comedy clubs. I like to change. I like to keep it up. And Criss Angel called me up, and I had no idea who he was. But he wanted to do a Buried Alive and a bullet catch. And, of course, I was known for the bullet catch, and I was the first one to be buried alive, 6 feet on the ground, dig my way out. And so I came to Vegas to visit with him, and he was flying all these magicians in to meet with him and everything. And we get talking. And I started talking to him about some things like pre-show and a few other things. He was like, I need you on my team. At that point, he had Johnny Thompson, who's got more money than God. But Johnny didn't really think outside the box. He thought within the box. And Criss was always wanting things outside the box. So they weren't a really good fit. But Johnny, freaking amazing man. Like, you hold a deck of cards and you're trying to do a move. So just move your thumb that way, and he knew it all. He knew it. He forgot more magic than God, like that Johnny did, right? But it wasn't a perfect fit for Criss. He had another guy who ran a magic store. So the guy knew a lot of little tricks and things like that. Really nice guy, Dexter, sweet man and a good man. And then he had another kid. I'm not going to say the name. Who really didn't know any magic at all. But the one thing he did know when Criss went to go sell it turned out to be somebody else's, and we didn't know, and Criss had to modify it and fix it. So that was his. Oh, and then John Farrell. John Farrell was a theater guy, and John became in charge of like the big A stunts, right? But it was like 3 weeks or 3 weeks before they were going to go into production that Criss said, I need you. And I was like, all right, so long as I can do the rest of the college, my college season is wearing down. I go off, I do the rest of those gigs. I'll make sure all your magic's ready. And, it became a lot of stuff in that first season was making things work because there were no methods for some of the stuff. So it was like making things work. And then after that, it was partway, like 2 weeks into shooting. We had to deliver 1.5 shows every week. And put that in perspective, David Blaine usually gets like a year to 2 years to make it special. Copperfield, the same thing. We were putting out 1.5 shows every single week. On top of that, keep in mind that every show is 22 minutes long. And we were just coming up with stuff for half the time. I mean, we would sit in a room on the average most seasons, and we would have to come up with close to 300 tricks, not knowing how we were going to do it. And then 2 weeks off, and it became my job and the team's work to sit down and try to figure out how to do these tricks. Criss also, interjected with that, and people think he didn't create. No, Criss is one of the most creative people I know as well. And we worked real well together, and that's why it became such a really good success. Where was I going with that? It was the creative process. The creative process, it was basically that goes back to my childhood. It goes back to when I was a kid of having to troubleshoot, because I'm more of a troubleshooter. You tell me what you want to do, I will come up with 3 or 4 ways to do it. And that also became the problem with the scientists. Was, why don't you just teach the scientists the tricks? Well, I've got like 10 different ways to bend keys. I teach you 3 of the most important ways. Somebody else is going to come along with a whole new way that I never had and do it. And you're going to think they're a genuine psychic. Better off to bring me in as professional, and I can take a look at it and say whether that's a trick or not. Who knows? Maybe I ought to even be fooled. But working with Criss was, it was intense at times because we were putting out so much. That first season, we had 7 episodes, I think it was. And after the 3rd episode went out, Chris's management brought us into the room and says, well, I got good news and bad news, boys. Good news is they want more shows. Bad news is they want 21 shows and they want it now. So we took a week off, sat down, wrote out all the other shows and all the magic we wanted to do, and then just kept on plugging away.
There's one episode of Mind Freak that I remember, and I think it was one of his later episodes. And the big trick of this episode was that Criss said he was going to, for a moment, raise somebody from the dead.
I wrote that episode. Yeah, I wrote.
Did you
I wrote
really?
Most of the episodes, but yes, I wrote that episode. Yeah.
Well, I remember that one scene where you're actually talking to Criss, saying, "Criss, why are you doing this? You shouldn't be doing this." Do you recall that? And did you write that as well?
I recall it. That scene was in there because we knew it was going to be a little icky. We knew there was going to be some ethical concerns, and it was one of those things. If we went straight into it with people just thinking that we hadn't thought about the ethical concerns of this, then that can be a problem. So that argument scene was, we knew we were going to be having that argument. So even though it felt very real and intense, and actually it did get intense at times because there were some things he wanted to do that I'm like, no, I was one of the last people on Mind Freak that could actually argue with Criss, because we did have some arguments about that episode. And I was one of the last people who could say no to him. And then it got to a point where he was just getting so famous. There's something that happens to every famous person at one point where everybody's telling them how great and how amazing they are. And it gets inside of their head at some point, and then they come back to reality. Criss is a good guy, and it ended up coming back. He came back to reality. That's where we were in that season as well at that point. So yeah, there was some of the things we put in some of the shows was because we were well aware of what lines we were coming up against, and so we wanted the audience to see those things, and maybe they can have those conversations at home themselves. Maybe they can talk about those things and debate it amongst themselves as well, knowing that we were actually also debating those type of things. One of the things in the first season was, like I said, I mentioned a minute ago, each trick is 22 minutes. And in that very, very first season, is this mostly just going out to magicians, or is it?
It's going out to everybody, anyone who's willing to listen.
Right, because I want to be careful what I expose and don't expose. So in the first season, Criss would show up. He said, "What am I doing today?" "Oh, that's that trick where I do this, this, and this." And go, "Yep." What am I going to say? And I said, "Well, we could try this." And I'd tell him something. Sometimes he came up with his own thing. "No, I don't like that," and do his own thing. But the problem is Criss would do the trick, and he would do one trick, a close-up trick, and it would last like 35 minutes. Or every episode's 22 minutes, right? So we had to edit a lot. And magicians sometimes are the worst at herding out craft. And they don't realize it sometimes because they're just trying to show how smart they're not, basically. Well, they're not trying to do that, but that is what they're doing. And so they cut everything down. They're the ones that will draw a circle of a shadow on a wall way back in the back and say that shadow belongs to this bar, that belongs to this illusion. And it's magicians that are doing it. And it's like, why are you doing that? You're hurting yourself by doing that. You're exposing your own magic. So then they would say, yeah, well, all the edits and all the cuts is what's hiding the magic. And that wasn't true. Sometimes if there was something really bad, we have to cut it out. And as we got into further seasons, there are things we had to cut out because nobody would know that, like that shadow, except for a magician. So now you got to edit that way, right? But we edit it down to make it fit in the context of a 22-minute show where you have an A stunt and you've got 2 or 3 other magic things that fall underneath that, right? And so we had to do a bunch of editing on that. And I know it bothered Criss a little bit that magicians were saying stuff like that, and they're the ones that were spreading all these terrible things. And to where in the second season there was a ring and an ice cube, and basically Criss re-showed that and showed as much as he could for an episode to show that it wasn't the editing that caused that ring that vanished from a teacher. And because people were saying the teachers are stooges, and well, no, they weren't. They didn't know how it was done, and it was their ring that ended up in the ice cube inside their drink, right? So now here's the other thing too. I have no problem using the medium. I want people at home, most of the time when I was there, I wanted people at home to see exactly what the people there were seeing. I'll give you an example. Johnny Ace Palmer, right? Goes to FISM, wins the entire FISM with cups and balls, but no balls. They're little chicks in the end, right? Underneath the cups. You could misdirect with your eyes an audience that's sitting there. You can misdirect by the way you move. You can misdirect by picking something up and you're doing something over here. But on a TV screen, it's a little bit different. He went on another TV show and it was a one camera shot above and you could see every load. So people at home are seeing something that nobody there saw. So for me, I would have no problem editing out those loads. None at all, because you're not supposed to see those loads and nobody would see it. But the only reason you're seeing it is because you're in this little frame right here. If I'm over here and I'm talking to you and I do a top change, I can have you looking at my eyes and I can do the worst top change in a way. Well, I can get away with it if I say something to you and I use the right moment. But if I'm within the screen and I do a top change, my hands are moving. That's a lot of freaking movement on a TV screen right there. So I have no problem editing that out. Magicians would say, well, that's Criss Angel's people standing there, when he's doing the illusion and, they're stooges. No, they're not freaking stooges. It's no different than if I'm doing a levitation on stage and I have my assistants, my dancers on stage and they're there. They're not going to sit there and go, oh, look, can you see that wire? They're not going to do that, right? The assistants on stage are going to look like they're amazed as well. So when you go out on the street, you do that. Now, you don't interview them and say, what did you think about the trick? What you do is you interview lay people that are there. That's what you do. But if you're smart, if you're out on the street, there might be something people see. So what do? You take 2 or 3 of your people and you have them stand in front of that object, that thing that you don't want anybody else to see. I have no problem with that. There was one episode I remember, and then that's it. I'm not going to talk anymore about this because exposing stuff. But I just want to give an example. There was one episode, I'm not saying what we did, but we needed to use a gimmick watch. We needed a gimmick watch, but we didn't want to use a stooge. So how do you get somebody to wear that watch and not think, and to believe that it's their watch? Or the production office, every day, there was a sign-in sheet for people that wanted to be on set. There's this one guy came every day for a week, never got on. And I noticed he didn't have a watch on. So the next day when he came, when we were shooting this, I'm like, I think it actually was a trick that we could shoot anytime while he's doing something else, if he's doing street magic. I said to him, hey, today's your lucky day. I'm going to take you over to the set. And we're going to use you, on the set. Come with me. We start walking. We get halfway there. I go, okay, so we're going to use your watch for this. And he goes, oh, I don't have a watch. I go, oh, damn it. Sorry, man. We need somebody with a watch. And then we start walking away. I go, you know what? No, never mind. And he goes, no. What were you going to say? I said, well, no, if Criss found out, he'd be really pissed off at me. He said, well, what do you mean? I said, I can go to the production office and borrow a watch from one of the guys that are sitting there. But you can't tell Criss it's not your watch because he's going to be mad at me. He wants somebody with a watch. But I know you've been wanting to be on the show oh, no problem. Get the watch. I put it on the guy's wrist. As far as he's concerned, I wanted to use his watch. He's begging me to give him a watch. Doesn't know it's a gimmick watch. And this is how we get somebody to wear a gimmick watch that truly is amazed and thinks like it could have been done with his watch. But magicians see it and see a little logo on it and they go, oh, that guy was a stooge. No, he wasn't. Think outside of the box, guys. And just because you don't know how something is done doesn't mean we're using stooges.
So you've had this absolutely incredible career. You've appeared in stages all over the world. You've appeared on television, and you even got to live the dream by headlining in Las Vegas at the Stratosphere. For you, as you look back on everything that you've accomplished, what sort of reflections do you have as you think about how you've really risen to be one of the top mentalists of our time?
It's actually overwhelming in a bit, and thinking about the amount of places I've been and what I've done. I mean, when I was doing colleges, I was doing about 125 average shows a year, just the colleges, not even counting the corporate that I was doing on those years. 2 years, 175. I mean, it's It's every small city, every big city in the U.S. I've driven every freeway. I performed everywhere. I performed on a train. A train is a funny one, actually. I was late. The train had actually pulled out, and the station master was there. And I talked to him. He said, "Oh, I get you on it. Get in the back of my truck." Get in the truck, and we go all the way across town. There's a place where the train slows down, right? And I got my little briefcase and everything. He says, "Okay, run out, hop on the train." I run out. I get on the back of the train. Now, the corporate people that hired me to work the train, they basically knew I had missed the train. And then all of a sudden, here I am. Nobody knew where I came from because the train's up at full speed again. And I come up and I'm like, "Yep, hello." And they're like, "How the hell?" He's a real magician. So I performed on a helicopter. I performed on an airplane. I performed on steamships. I performed. It's like hard to find a place that I haven't performed, actually, right? I've been to every continent except Antarctica. I think I might go there, and I think that's where they have penguins. Do a car trick for a penguin, so I can say I've been there too, and get the hell out of there because it's cold and I don't like the cold. But I've lectured, around the world. When I was doing the colleges, they were slow in the summertime. So I would take like a month and I would do like 27 lectures in 28 different cities in like Spain or France or Germany, and just all around the world. And so I've seen everything. I've done everything. And I often say to people, I don't want to die tomorrow, but if I die tomorrow, I'm okay. I just don't want to die with pain. But I'm okay because I've lived the life of 20 or 30 people. Some people don't get to leave their town. For me, the most fascinating thing is knowing that, hey, when I'm at a hotel, I know there's a secret door that gets you around that way, that nobody else knows about except for the staff. But I know at casinos in town that the eye in the sky isn't in the sky. It's actually in the basement here or there, and what door you go to get down there. And, I've got all these other little wonderful secrets, and I have to remind myself once in a while how lucky I am when I go to places because I take so much of it for granted. The one thing I would give younger people advice on is life is about memories. In the end, doesn't matter how much money you have. If you've not made memories, you have not lived. And that is my one regret, is that I do travel and have traveled so much that I wasn't smelling the roses along the way. When I was go to the colleges again, but it could be done, I could talk about the corporate or the trade shows, same thing. You fly in, you get in that evening, and you do a show and you're gone out the next day. And when I was doing colleges, I was getting no more than 4 or 5 hours sleep a night because I was traveling so much. I had a custom van and I would drive from gig to gig. And, one day I'm in North Dakota, next day I'm down in Florida, next day I'm over in Texas, and, then I'm up in Delaware. And, take a few extra days along your trip. And even if you're spending money, it's okay. It's okay to spend the money for those memories because that's why you're making the money. You're not just making money so you can pay your bills and pay your house off. You need to create memories.
When you perform, and it probably varies from audience to audience, but what are some things that you want your audience to walk away with after they see a Banachek show?
What are some things I want I had a show that was called Telepathy, and I created that show for a very specific. Most of my shows don't have specific reasons. The Strat did because there was affiliation with the James Randi Educational Foundation. I wanted to promote critical thinking on that there. Telepathy was another one that was like that. And Telepathy, I would come out in the whole first part of the show, and I'm getting to your question, but the whole first part of that show as if I was a genuine psychic. And I would end the first part of that show talking to the dead. Now, it's the most despicable thing I think you can ever do, right? I hated it and I cringed when I was doing it because I'm talking to people's dead relatives. But I was very, very, very careful not to change their thinking about that person. I was basically feeding them back information, not changing that information, not adding to it or doing anything like that. But it was a very strong show, and it was all about what telepathy is, what Sir Arthur Conan Doyle thought it was, Sherlock Holmes, Einstein, Marie Curie, and I was able to build through that. Second part of the show, I come back, and I allude that it's real, but then I get to a point where I'm talking about the mediums, and I say they're scum. Why can I say that? Because now I can talk about my life. Now, we had a way and about all this stuff is BS, right? And we had a way where we would get information back from people after shows, and for weeks at a time, we're still getting information back from those people. And we would here's a perfect example. Here's one that stuck out to me, but there were a lot that were like this. There was a girl that wrote to us and said, I just wanted to write and thank you. My mom believes in psychic phenomena. I don't. I'm a skeptic. I don't believe in it. And we've had some really bad arguments, really, really bad arguments where we don't talk for weeks at a time. And we saw your show and we're like, all right, my mom saw the show and she wanted me to come. And so I came. That first half part of the show, I started to question my beliefs. I was like, oh, maybe this is real. My mom, she was digging it in a little bit, saying, look, I told you this stuff's real. We get out in the lobby, intermission, we're talking about it, and I'm realizing I might be wrong. Then we come back in the second part, and you talk about it all being BS. On the way home, it was over an hour to drive home. My mom and I had the best conversations about this stuff because we realized how the other person, I realized why my mom believed in this because I almost did. She realized my side of things as well because of the things that you've been through and you were talking about. And I was like, that's really nice. It's nice for people to be able to discuss these things. Most of my shows, like when I'm working on cruise ships, it's more about, even though I'm telling you it's not real, it's just about the entertainment value. It's more about how could he have done that. There is something, my ex-manager, Tyus, a wonderful guy, used to always tell people, he says, I didn't know how it was going to work when I started working with Banachek because, he has these disclaimers. He says this stuff isn't real. But then I watched it and he said, there's something really fascinating to be able to tell your audience that this stuff is not real. And then still in the moment, right after you said that, convince them that it is, only to come back and tell them that it's not real again. He says to get away with that. And he was just giving me a really, a huge compliment. He says, it's not everybody that can actually get away with that and do that at that level. So that's, I don't know. I get joy out of that.
Well, Banachek, I have one more question for you, my friend. And I think you kind of answered this already, but since this is how we end every episode, I'll go ahead and ask it anyway. What's the one piece of advice that has served you well that you'd want everyone else to hear?
Ooh, that's a hard one for me. And I'll tell you why that's a hard one for me. That's a hard one for me because my set of circumstances. That's another thing Tyus used to say. He used to talk about some of the most successful people are people that didn't have any other options. And in a way, I had no other options. I was raising my brothers. I couldn't go to college, didn't know how to go to college, couldn't afford to go to college. This was almost thrust upon me in a way. So, that's a hard, I would have to say that I answered that in a different way of saying, take the time, smell the roses along the way, and enjoy it and invest time and money in yourself and your friends and your family, rather than all the other BS and stuff that's out there and, all the politics and the fighting and the arguing, find ways that you can love people. I've got a group of guys I play squash with on Thursday nights. It's like the number one attorney in town, the number one neuroscientist in town, the number one dentist in town. So these are all like super, super rich, wealthy human beings. The guy that holds it has a squash court in his basement's basement, full-size Olympic squash court in his basement's basement, right? And then afterwards we go out to the library and we drink the best whiskey in the world. And every time I'm with them, I feel like I'm the schmuck at Dinner for Schmucks or whatever that was called, that movie, right? It's like, why am I here? It's funny because I just had that same experience. I was just on a panel. And it was Neil deGrasse Tyson. It was Criss, what's his name, the black hole guy right next to me, another brilliant physicist, another physicist to my left. And there I am, a mentalist sitting there, and they're asking us questions, and they're giving all these, I'm like, why am I here? I'm the schmuck for dinner for schmuck guy, right? So, but then somebody else reminded me, yeah, you're the top of, you are at that level in your own thing. And I was like, oh, that's nice. But back to the whiskey. There's Democrats, there's Republicans, there's Libertarians, there's everything in between. We discuss everything and anything. There is nothing, none of us could be president because of the humor that we have and the jokes that we tell, and just so inappropriate, but we all laugh at each other. Nobody gets mad. There are some heated discussions, but nobody's mad. I would be there for any one of those guys if they call me in a second, and any one of those guys would be there for me. And I wish the rest of the world was more like that, not where families are no longer talking to each other because of politics. It's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. You've loved this person your entire life, and then all of a sudden this one thing, you think they're an idiot and stupid and you hate them. No, you don't. You're just caught up in your own projections. Stop living within your own brain. Start looking at things from other people's point of view. Start understanding things, with intent. Somebody says something to you, doesn't mean, even if you're offended by it, that's okay. You have a right to be offended. That doesn't mean they were trying to offend you. So don't get mad at them about it. Have a discussion with people. I'm sorry, I'm going off on a tangent because I don't know how to answer your question.
But that sounds great, though. That's still a great response. Banachek, this is a really big honor for me. Thank you so much, and I wish for nothing but continued success in your career,
my friend. Take care. Next time, if we ever do this again, let's talk about Peter Popoff, the evangelist, and go in some of the other directions, too. There's so much more we can cover, so maybe we'll do this again sometime. I would love that.
No, that would be great.
Take care, buddy.
I truly love that piece of advice. Remember to love each other. It's so important, especially now. We don't have to agree with everyone, but we can still love each other. Stop living within your own brain. A very big thank you to Banachek for talking to me today. He's an extremely kind individual, and I feel so honored to have spent time with him. Do yourselves a favor and go to his website, banachek.com, and find out how you can check out his incredible show. Well, my friends, that's going to do it for Season 5. I hope you all enjoyed this season. I know I did. Please feel free to give the show a rating and a review, and be sure to check out my new website, ldmadera.com. What will Season 6 have in store? I'm sure we'll find out soon enough. I'm LD Madera, and don't forget, you are who you are, and you are special. Catch you next time on the next season of Improv and Magic.